I am now.
So today what we'll do is we'll add our final layer to our three-level timeline by adding the First Amendment. And your notes need to be very detailed here because obviously the First Amendment is the point of this class.
It's not the way I like. All right. You know.
And so again, just as a reminder, we said that the top line is U.S. and Supreme Court history, the middle line is 14th Amendment history, and the bottom line now is First Amendment history. Some people who take notes on a laptop, if you're doing a vertical timeline, that's fine in terms of getting the information down, but it's not good for studying. I just know from experience. Because doing all of these on the same timeline, you're going to end up blurring the lines between which types of cases these are. And so the visualization here helps as a study guide because it compartmentalizes the information, breaks it into more digestible chunks. So even if you're taking notes on a laptop, you really should reproduce this on paper the old-fashioned way. So we said, of course, 1791, the First Amendment comes to life as part of the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is ratified. And we said our 14th Amendment timeline was going to start over here at 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Now, we're not going to get any meaningful activity on our First Amendment timeline until 1907. I mean, from 1791 all the way to 1907, we have really no significant First Amendment case to talk about. Right? First Amendment historians talk about the First Amendment in its dormant years. There's just nothing to talk about. Right? First of all, there aren't many cases at all, and there are no significant ones. Why do you think, based on your knowledge of the wording of the First Amendment, why do you think there were not many First Amendment cases? There just weren't many. Think about this era. We're in an era of formalism. Formalism is an interpretive philosophy that interprets the Constitution in a very rigid way based on a strict reading of the words of the Constitution. So what are the first 5 words of the First Amendment?
Congress shall make no law.
Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law. And so if you're going to file a lawsuit and say that the government has violated your First Amendment rights, what are the 2 elements that must be present based on a strict reading of the First Amendment?
A law
A law
and a Congress.
passed specifically by Congress. So the only way you can have a First Amendment case is if the dispute is about a law passed by Congress. That really narrows the possibilities for a First Amendment case, right? Because it can only be under that circumstance. It's a very strict reading. Now we talk about our federalist system. We have the law operating at the federal level, and we have the law operating at the state level. How does that also mean that we're going to have a very limited number of First Amendment cases? What level does the First Amendment operate at? Federal. Because it only involves Congress. So the First Amendment is limited in terms of which level of government it can operate on, only the federal level. And it's also limited to only being disputes about laws specifically passed by Congress. That's it. So there's just very little use, or very few ways to use the First Amendment. And so it's not until I'm going to just say equals strict interpretation that type of, the reason, what do you think is the relationship between slavery and legal formalism? If there is one. And there is.
I would say that slave owners used formalism maybe as an excuse because it didn't, in the Constitution, it does not read that slaves are considered citizens. And so they don't really have to give them any rights because there's
Because
nothing.
the Constitution and Bill of Rights didn't give them any rights? Okay. All right, that's one way. What else? What did we say about property law in early America?
White men.
You have to own property to vote.
What's that?
You have to own property to vote.
That's true, which says what about property?
It's valued.
And it's something very important, and property law is the most important area of law, right? And part of the reason that we talk about the primacy of property in those early years is because what is a slave?
Property.
Property law is the legal framework that keeps a slave a slave. And so by strictly interpreting the Constitution and also by, in other areas of law too, like being very strict in your interpretation of contract law or property law, formalism, legal formalism helped perpetuate and protect the institution of slavery, right? Because, so the legal fiction, a legal fiction is when you say something absurd that sounds absurd on its face, but it's how the law operates. And so think about this. So the legal fiction that keeps slavery in place, a sack of flour is a piece of property, a slave is a piece of property, therefore they are similarly situated, and a slave shall be treated the same way as a sack of flour. Right? I mean, any child could see that they're not the same thing, right? But the legal conceit is both are treated the same as property. That's an example of how formalism, a certain way of seeing the law and using the law, helped perpetuate slavery. But it also helped mean that the First Amendment was not doing a whole lot to protect people's freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so what we see is, as we said, that one of the central themes in our discussion about the 14th Amendment was that for decades and decades and decades, the Supreme Court was not using the 14th Amendment to protect African Americans, even though it was written to do that. It wasn't using the 14th Amendment, in fact, to protect people at all. Who was it using the 14th Amendment to protect? Maybe.
People who had property right who were higher up on
The elites,
right.
the rich people, right? What else? What's the significance of the Santa Clara case of 1886? This is how you got to prepare for the exam, and this is how you have to study. What's the connection between how the court not using the 14th Amendment to protect people, individuals, it was using it more often to protect
Businesses.
corporations. And the key significance of the Santa Clara case of 1886 was it invented what concept? Another legal fiction. Someone look it up. It should be in your notes. And if it's not in your notes, it means that you were sitting here looking at box scores on ESPN. Nope. Should be in your notes. I don't know how you're going to study for the exam if it ain't in your notes. I'm trying to teach you how to prepare, how to take notes, and how to be successful in this first exam. It should be right on your timeline. What is it? No. It should be right on your timeline. And if you have not reproduced these timelines in your notes, you are going to be in a world of hurt on the first exam. You're going to fail. Right? That's why I stand up here doing it every day. You should be taking notes. No, what is the significance of the case? I'm being bitchy with you guys because I'm scared that you're not taking notes, you're not paying attention, and I'm going to get a bunch of F's on the first exam. And I don't want it. What is the significance of the Santa Clara case of 1886? It should be right on your timeline. It should take you 2 seconds to find it.
I stopped at 1883.
Yeah. He's on Google.
But how does he?
He's on Google, that's why. I copy everything. How's it possible it's all filtered?
Okay, everybody. All right, everybody, calm down. I'll calm down too, because I was starting to get my back up. So, are you saying that we didn't make it that far on
No.
time?
That's correct.
That's what we're saying.
1983.
Okay.
Years,
All right, I'm sorry. I'm teaching 3 sections and I thought we were all together. Okay.
we're good kids.
All right, so let's back up. So we had 1883, which was what? The civil rights cases, which gave us state action doctrine. 1886, you can just call it the Santa Clara case. And Daniel, I'm talking into the tape now, sorry for that whole. So the Santa Clara case. The Santa Clara case, Mr. Vaughn, what did you find when you Googled that?
I didn't do
That 2-word phrase.
Corporate personhood.
Corporate personhood. So again, it's like that whole thing that I just described about the slave and the sack of flour. It's a legal fiction. Corporate personhood is a kind of legal fiction. What do you think? What does your gut tell you that phrase means? Corporate personhood.
Maybe recognized as individuals.
Yeah. They'll be treated like a person. A corporation will be treated like a person. But you think, well, wait a minute. Santa Clara, there was a series of cases. Let me take 1 minute to explain this. So there was a series of cases in the 19th century that came to be known as the railroad cases. And because what was happening was, we're in the Reconstruction era. Remember on your timeline, it's the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And that literally meant reconstructing. And a big part of the Reconstruction was the build out of the railroads, right? The Transcontinental Railroad and building the whole railroad network. Well, steam locomotives, anybody a rail hobby person? Anybody's father a rail hobby person? Yeah, so steam locomotives are humongous, monstrously large machines, and they're very dangerous. People who worked in that industry, it was a dangerous industry, getting their arms cut off, getting their legs cut off. One of my uncles who worked on the Long Island Railroad had both of his legs cut off. People getting killed, maimed. Also, damaging people's property. You got this big, humongous machine that is run, they're burning either coal or wood. And trains run into your property and sparks are coming off that thing and it sets your property on fire. So there were lots and lots of disputes created by the railroads, either because of injuries to workers or because of property damage and that sort of thing. And the courts, generally in these cases, favored the railroads. So for example, if states started trying to pass laws to regulate the railroads would challenge those laws as unconstitutional. And here's what I mean by the railroads and the Supreme Court hijacked the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is written in 1868 to protect African Americans, specifically. Well, now we get, and there are more than one case, but the Santa Clara we think of as the sort of best illustration of this. Smart, clever lawyer goes into court for the railroad and says these rules and regulations violate our 14th Amendment right. Now, so at first you think, what? That's crazy. That doesn't even make sense. Is a railroad an African American? So put your lawyer cap on. All right. Think if you had to stand up with a straight face and make this argument in court, how would you do it? Okay. So first of all, you said we're going to use the 14th Amendment. All right. How can we use the 14th Amendment? How many clauses are there in the 14th Amendment?
6.
That's the First Amendment. 3. If there are 3 clauses, it means what? Then there are 3 what?
Right.
Rights. And if there are 3 rights, there are 3 litigation strategies. So you got to pick one or more, but okay, so we got to pick one of those clauses to litigate this case under. So which do you think you're going to choose? Just use your imagination. Think about what are the 3 clauses? Equal protection, due process, and equal protection, due process, and what is it? Should be right on your timeline, or near your timeline when we talked about this last time. Privileges or immunities. What do we know about the privileges or immunities clause? It was shut down by what case? The slaughterhouse cases. What year? 1873. So now we only have 2 litigation strategies left. Equal protection and due process. Which one are you going to use? Equal protection. How would that work?
If you are treating, I don't know this is yes, but if you're treating the corporation the same as a person, then they should receive.
No, you're not doing that. You are a railroad lawyer, and you're saying these rules and regulations regulating the railroad business violate our 14th Amendment rights, and you're going to argue equal protection. So just use your imagination. How would you argue that? Why would they be violating your equal protection? You could make that argument if you want. Yeah. I want to get you thinking, reasoning, like think for yourself. I shouldn't have to give you every answer.
It's kind of equal protection because for citizens that live close to the railroad that are affected by it, like it's not fair for them because they're not, they have.
Wait, remember, Mr. Lovering, who you're representing. You're not representing the people who live near the railroad. You are the railroad. You are representing the railroad. And you're saying these rules and regulations of our business violates our equal protection under the 14th Amendment. You see, it's different. You're not representing those people. You're trying to defend the railroad.
I mean, if I'm going to defend the railroad, I'm going to take probably every rational and irrational step to make sure that we get out of this alive. So if treating us better than citizens is not getting us what we want, then I would go due process.
But I want somebody to, before you do that, I want somebody to make the equal protection argument. I want you to use your brains, and I want you to reason and think for yourselves, right? Think through it. How do you put one thing connected to the other? How can you make the argument? The state passes a regulation that puts certain strict rules on you, the railroad company. How are you going to argue to me that that is violating your equal protection under the 14th Amendment?
Well, this is a stretch, but can you say like the railroad owns property, so then like you have like rights?
Okay, but that's not an equal protection argument, is it?
No,
Where is
I don't-
property discussed in the 14th Amendment?
I don't know. The company, the people working for the company, property of the company, so people working on the railroads are getting their 14th Amendment taken away.
Okay, that can be part of your argument. You can say these people who work for the railroad are people, and because they're people, they have 14th Amendment rights. That's exactly right. And so somebody make the equal protection argument.
So it's really protecting like the workers or people who make up that corporation instead of just using whole.
Right. So you're making the first argument, which is the corporation should be treated as a person. If you look at the text of the 14th Amendment, you've got to figure out how to make your argument work with the words of it. And it says person. But where does the word property and where does the word person appear in the 14th Amendment?
Section 1.
Well, all of it appears in Section 1 that we're discussing. Which clause? The due process clause, all right? So that's how you've got to think categorically. If I say there are 3 clauses, that means there are 3 rights. That means there are 3 possible litigation strategies. And if you're trying to make an argument about property or you're trying to make an argument about persons, where do you find those words? They're in the due process clause. So that's how you have to build the argument. The equal protection clause doesn't say anything about property or people or that sort of thing, right? So that's how you do it. And so that's what they did. And they said, just like you guys said, the corporation is made up of lots of people, therefore it should be treated like a person. So exactly as you guys said, and then exactly like you said, although you were thinking about the equal protection clause, but you're using exactly the right word, seize on the word property, and say, if you have these rules and regulations, you are interfering with our property and our use of our property. And that's what they did. And so that's how, you see, they have to go through those kind of fancy footwork to get to this idea. This is why, for example, a few years ago in the Citizens United case, remember that case where the Supreme Court struck down about 100 years worth of campaign finance law? It was a First Amendment case, and they were treating, it was about how much corporations can contribute to campaigns. And they said, based on this doctrine, this is called corporate personhood doctrine, these corporations are people, a legal fiction, therefore they have First Amendment speech rights, and giving money to a campaign is a type of speech. So they have to go through those sorts of moves in order to strike down the campaign finance laws as unconstitutional, and it's all based on this very old case from 1887. You see how once the court creates a certain rule or doctrine, it can then live for a very long time. Remember we said that once they shut down the privileges or immunities clause, you can't use it anymore. So these cases have very long-lasting effects. Okay, and then just finally, and then the last one that we put on our 14th Amendment timeline for now, you had it already. Right, Plessy, v. Ferguson. I don't know how we did not get these last two cases when we did in other classes. And that, do you remember what doctrine that creates?
No, I think
We were just mentioning it in our long discussion about slavery.
Separate but equal doctrine?
Yeah, it created separate but equal doctrine. And so the case is about, do you remember what the case is about? It's about an African American man, and the railroads once again figure prominently in constitutional law. So they had two cars, one for blacks and one for whites, and the one for whites was really nice and the one for blacks was really crappy. And he was sick of sitting in the crappy car. I don't blame him. And so he went and sat in the white car. So that, we get into then the dispute, and it's argued, it's litigated as a 14th Amendment case. He's arguing that his 14th Amendment rights are being violated. And so out of the three clauses, once again, think about it, which clause would be the most appropriate to litigate that case under?
Equal protection?
Yeah, there it would make sense to talk about equal protection. He'd be saying, I'm not being treated equally. But the court disagreed, and that's when they came up with this idea and said, it's okay that they're separate. As long as there is a car for blacks and there is a car for whites, then everybody's being treated equal. And so, the way we can think of, if we do this part on the board, we had de facto slavery. And then once the Constitution is written, we have the de jure slavery era. What's the difference between de facto and de jure? That's someone else. What's that? Yes, de jure is by law, de facto is just, it's a fact, just by the facts on the ground. So slavery existed, but we had not said anything about it in the Constitution or in our constitutional system because we didn't have a Constitution yet. Then we get a Constitution in 1789, which instantiates slavery as a matter of law. And then we flash forward to the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, what did the 13th Amendment do? Abolish slavery. What did the 15th Amendment do? Give African Americans the vote. And then 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments. So we have the de facto slavery era, the de jure slavery era, followed by the Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction era included the Reconstruction Amendments. Are those on your timeline? Okay, good. And with Plessy, then a significant change in your notes, just so that you know, as a matter of fact, do you have 1877 and the military Reconstruction?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but as a constitutional matter, the Reconstruction era ends with Plessy. This is another example of how a court case or a legal rule or a legal regime can shape the world around us, whether we realize the law is doing this or not. So Reconstruction is ended by Plessy because Plessy introduces the idea of separate but equal. And we go from having, check this out as far as being parallel, de facto segregation, meaning it's just how things were. You had the blacks over here, you had the whites over here, and between shall meet. Plessy then introduces de jure segregation. Segregation by law. You see, everyone, you have an image in your mind, those iconic images of the separate bathrooms and the separate water fountains and the separate schools. That was not, that's part of that era. That's not necessarily part of this era, even though that's people lived separately. But now we have literally the Supreme Court, because of separate but equal doctrine, is literally giving the stamp of approval to the states and local towns to actually have laws that force people to be separate. And so it's very different. It's like they've given a green light. It's a license for legally enforced segregation. And that's when all those laws come on the books, especially in the South. Right? Anti-miscegenation laws. What's an anti-miscegenation? It's when the states had laws, literally laws, that said a white person and a black person cannot get married. Can you imagine the government reaching so far into people's lives, telling people who they can marry and who they can't? Oh yeah, the government still does that, doesn't it? Yeah. Right. But so we actually had laws that said the schools had to be separate, laws that said the neighborhoods had to be separate, laws that said blacks had to sit in the back of the bus. That wasn't just custom and tradition. So once again, we had, like just as in Dred Scott, once again we got the Supreme Court being asked to help us figure out, help us solve this societal problem, and we had the Supreme Court just pouring gas on the fire and making it worse. Thanks, Supreme Court. So because they usher in, what is this era called, starting in 1896? An era where you actually have laws segregating people. What's that called?
De jure segregation.
Yeah, I know it's de jure segregation, but what's the era? See, this is an example of how, as a legal matter, it's de jure segregation, but we, as a cultural or social matter, what do we call it?
Civil rights era?
Mm-hmm. It's the opposite of the civil rights era.
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow. So again, it's an example of something that we think of as a cultural or a historical phenomenon, but it's really a legal phenomenon. It's a situation created by law. The Supreme Court literally ushers in the Jim Crow era. Thanks, Supreme Court. And then if you just wanted to make your timeline pretty, well, the Jim Crow era is going to go all the way to 1954. What ended the Jim Crow era?
Brown versus Board
Brown.
of Education.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. Brown v. the Board, so the Jim Crow era runs all the way to 1954, and once again, a Supreme Court decision launches a new era, and now what is this new era called from Brown forward? The Civil Rights era. And the way we're going to do it, it's the Civil Rights era, part 1, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. Okay, so there, my apologies, everybody. I thought we had gotten through that last bit of the 14th Amendment. Yeah.
On our last timeline, there was a section talking about Reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
Okay, maybe that's.
Reconstruction after the Civil War. So from the end of the Civil War all the way through Plessy v. Ferguson is Reconstruction. Okay, so we're caught up. I owe y'all an apology. Okay, so now we're caught up with other classes, and now here's where I was going to start today. So that completes, for now, for the time being, our 14th Amendment timeline all the way through 1896. And now we begin our First Amendment timeline. So we said, because we're in an era when we very strictly interpret the words, there's very little action on our First Amendment timeline. And then we finally get some action with a case called Patterson v. Colorado. Now, you may think that because of the First Amendment, the American government doesn't throw journalists in jail just for doing their jobs, but you'd be wrong. The government throws journalists in jail a lot just for doing their jobs and continues to do that today. Back in this era, one of the ways you could get thrown in jail for being a journalist, just doing your job, is if you're writing about some trial. And let's say you disagree. Well, I'll give you a great example. Let's say you're a journalist and you're writing about the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin trial. And at the end, when you see what happens, you write a scathing editorial saying that the court got it completely wrong. That sounds pretty normal, right? Back in this era, if you did that, you could end up in jail, right? Because the judge could get really mad at you, and this happened all the time throughout the 19th century, and hold you in contempt of court. What is contempt of court? What is it? What does your gut tell you those words mean? It could be interrupting or just
disagreeing, so it's
contempt.
Even like disrespect or disobey.
Yeah, to disrespect or disobey. That's nail on the head. So, if you disrespect the court, like let's say you disrupt the proceedings in the courtroom, or let's say, as Ms. Hollywood was saying, that you are showing disrespect for the court, you're criticizing the court. What's another way that you can show the court that you just don't care? How can you disobey?
Not show up.
Not show up. Right? You don't show up when you get a subpoena. And what's a subpoena?
In order to appear in court.
In order to appear. And under subpoena means under pain, meaning there will be a penalty if you don't show up. And the penalty would be contempt of court. One of the penalties could be contempt of court. And you could be fined money, or you could be thrown in jail, or both. And this happened to journalists a lot during the 19th century, and that's what this case is about. They printed something that they were critical of the court for a decision that the court made. They were held in contempt. This is called contempt by publication. And it was very common for journalists to be punished like this. Well, the journalists were sick of it, right? They had just had a whole century of being thrown in jail just for writing critical things about a court, and they sued and say that it violates our First Amendment rights under freedom of the press to throw us in jail simply for doing our job. Who do you think the Supreme Court sided with? Think about our experience so far under the 14th Amendment.
They sided with Colorado.
They sided with the government against the journalists, and they said, nope, it doesn't violate your First Amendment rights to throw you in jail. But the significance for us, it equals the first press clause case. It's the very first time that a case under the press clause has reached the Supreme Court. It's the very first time. So the dormant years are broken. We finally get a big case before the Supreme Court, although the results of it weren't that great. And then the next big move we've got is 1919. And the quartet of cases, the quartet. Why do you think, put on your historian's cap a moment, why do you think that this era, now remember, cases take a while to reach the Supreme Court, so the disputes in these cases all really happened like a year before, 1918. Why do you think 1918 was a very interesting time that had lots and lots of interesting cases? What was going on?
Prohibition. World War I.
World War I. Whenever we have times of conflict and great national stress, those are always very interesting times in constitutional law, and we get all sorts of interesting constitutional cases, including right now. So here we are. Think about this. So we had all those, the exciting Reconstruction years and the early part of the 20th century were really sort of golden, in many ways, golden times in America because it was a real growth period. And then we had the disaster of World War I. Now, so World War I is like, it's like the second very famous time when a president lied the country into war. So you could start with McKinley and the Spanish-American War in the 1890s, which was built on lies. And then with World War I, Woodrow Wilson, who graduated from Davidson College in North Carolina, and was a historian, but he was a liar. So he campaigned on the promise to keep the United States out of World War I. And then once he got in office, he immediately dragged the country into World War I, got the country involved in World War I. But the country was bitterly, bitterly divided about it. And so there was a lot of, as you can imagine, people thinking that they were exercising their First Amendment rights, and what were they doing? They were protesting. They were speaking out. They were writing. They were writing editorials. They were handing out pamphlets, anti-war pamphlets, right? Now, one thing you have to remember that's very, very different from today, because your whole lives you think about our political system just being two parties, right? In Washington, it's either the Crooks and Liars Party or the Liars and Crooks Party. But back then, we had a much more dynamic political system, much more fluid. There was a very big and active socialist party, and there was even a active communist party, right? Because what happened in 1917, 1918, in addition to World War I? What other big world-shaping event?
The Espionage Act.
What?
The Espionage Act.
We're getting there. But what was happening halfway around the world that led to the
Wasn't he
espionage?
assassinated?
It was a
the Russian Revolution.
Russian Revolution.
Oh, sure.
And so, when the Russian Revolution was over, what political system emerged?
Communism.
Communism. And that led to what era in this country? The Red Scare. Good. And the Red Scare led to Espionage Act of 1917, right? Because it's, commie under every bed, look out, right? And so we had the Red Scare. And so up here on this timeline, we can say 1917, Congress wrote the Espionage Act. And then in 1918, they added a second part, the Sedition Act. What is sedition? What's sedition?
It's like talking bad about the government openly.
Talking bad about the government, criticizing the government. Seditious libel is criticizing the government. And you think, well, wait a minute. We just had this whole discussion the other day about values of free expression, and right near the top of the list was participation in self-government. I mean, if we're going to participate in self-government, can't that include criticizing the government? And you think, well, how could that exist? How could a law that could penalize you for criticizing the government, how could that possibly coexist with the First Amendment? Well, I'll tell you a story. In 1798, at the behest of President Adams, that very thin-skinned blowhard hated him. And so he was sick of people criticizing him, and so he goes to his buddies in Congress and gets them to pass the Aliens and Sedition Act of 1798. Now, the first part we're not so interested in. This is, if you think that you are tired of hearing politicians run around talking about illegal immigrants, you ain't heard nothing yet, because this argument started in 1798. And that stuff's been going on ever since. Right? That's what this part of the act was about. It was cracking down on illegal immigrants. This part was making it a crime, a punishable crime, to criticize the government. Adams is furious. Madison is furious. Right? Because look, the ink on the First Amendment's barely dropped. And you're talking about a serious abridgment of people's freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And think about how it perfectly fits the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Congress made a law abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It's a slam dunk First Amendment case, right? But we never get to hear the Supreme Court say anything about it because Jefferson is elected in 1800, thank God, and with the end of the Adams administration, the law goes off the books. So we don't get to hear what the Supreme Court had to say about it. Then we get 1865 is pointing to the 13th Amendment. 1861 is pointing to the Sedition Act of 1861. Lincoln was a great president in many ways, but he was terrible. He sucked when it came to the First Amendment. All sorts of speech and press violations throughout the Civil War. Journalists thrown in jail left and right. Newspapers closed down left and right. Sometimes the Yankees didn't even bother with the niceties of law. They would just show up at a newspaper and bust up the presses. So, terrible, terrible time for First Amendment rights. And once again, we have Congress passing a law that abridges people's freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But again, the Supreme Court doesn't get to say anything about it because when the war ends, the law expires.
So which is it, 1917 through 18, or
1917, 1917, they passed the Espionage Act.
the Sedition Act is?
Well, which one? There are three. So the Sedition Act, that's actually, it's good that you say that, Mr. Vaughn. And we should do it this way. That's why we always say the Sedition Act of 1798, the Sedition Act of 1861, and the Sedition Act of 1918. So once again, after the war ends, that Sedition Act just expires. And so again, we don't get to hear what the Supreme Court says about it. Fast forward, once again, where it's a time of war, a time of conflict, we get the government taking away our civil liberties, which they always do during these times, and it's in wartime is a very legally significant phrase, because in wartime is a trigger that actually gives the government more leeway to take away our civil rights. So that's why if you have an event like 9/11, and then you have George W. Bush going on television every day saying, I'm a wartime president, I'm a wartime president, we're a nation at war, it's wartime, wartime, wartime. That's why. Because it's a legal trigger that gives the government license to do things that they can't do in peacetime. Okay? So the government always likes for us to be in wartime. So here we have this, it once again happens, and like during the Civil War, the government's throwing people in jail left and right, and that's where the quartet of cases comes from. The Socialist Party and the Communist Party were both staunchly and vociferously anti-war. Their position was, this war does not benefit America, this war does not benefit the citizens of America. This war is simply something that the elite and powerful are interested in pursuing at the expense of the rest of us. And so they were just using their free speech and freedom of the press to say those things. And all of these cases involve socialists and communists. And so the quartet starts with Schenck, S-C-H-E-N-C-K. These people were all convicted under the Sedition Act and thrown in jail, literally thrown in jail, just for writing things and speaking out against the war. Case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, so the legal question is, did the government violate these people's free speech rights by throwing them in jail, by punishing them for things that they said? And the court said no. The court said it's okay to throw them in jail. It doesn't violate their First Amendment rights. But of course, whenever the court makes a decision, it has to come out with a rationale. And the rationale that the court came up with, and you've probably heard this phrase before, is that what those people said and wrote represented a clear and present danger to the nation and its people.
Isn't that now part of like a test? Like there's a test to see if somebody violates the First Amendment, and that's part of it?
What's that saying?
It's the clear and present danger test.
Oh,
There you go.
Right. So it becomes the clear and present danger test. Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote this decision, and he's the one who came up with the clear and present danger test. Now, riddle me this. Somebody explain as precisely as you can what clear and present mean.
Like right now, and everybody can, like, people are listening to you, people know who you are, and people can hear your opinion, and right now.
Okay, it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay, people can see you, and it's right now.
Yeah, like right now and during wartime.
Oh, so you're qualifying it and saying it has to be during wartime?
I mean, I'm not making the law, but I mean, if
that's true.
I was, I probably would.
Okay, that would be a good idea. That's going to be a really good idea in 1931. So you're going in the right direction. The law hasn't caught up with you yet, though. Anybody else want to very precisely define clear and present? Can you?
It's interpretive.
It's very vague.
Yeah.
It's vague, and that's the exact word that we want to use. You always have a problem in First Amendment law if the terms are vague. It's called a vagueness problem. So you have a vagueness problem because of these terms. So what is the effect on our First Amendment protection if all the government has to do is say that it's a clear and present danger?
Zero. zero, I guess.
Yeah, it basically rips up our protection because it rips a loophole in the First Amendment that's big enough to drive a truck through. Right? It's very easy for the government. And then we see the results of that in Debs, Froberg, and Abrams. So once the test is created, we then get all in the same year, case after case after case, where the court uses the weak, clear, and present danger test to side with the government against the speaker.
And these are all protesting cases?
All of these cases are people who were anti-war protesters, and they were writing things that were against the war. And the government is using the law as a weapon to punish people simply for disagreeing. How's that? And so then these people are trying to use the First Amendment as a shield. Remember? We said it's a shield to protect the individual from the terrifying power of the state. And the Supreme Court sided with the terrifying power of the state every time. And these people were all thrown in jail. These are not just nobodies. Does anyone remember who Eugene Debs was?
He was the leader of the Socialist Party in America.
He was the founder and leader of the Socialist Party in America. He ran for president 4 times. Right? This isn't just some nut jobs. Right? He was a very serious intellectual who ran for president. When he ran for president the first time, he got 3% of the popular vote. That's not chicken feed. 3% of the popular vote. Well, they threw him in jail. Gave him 10 years in jail. How's that?
10 years.
10 years. Just for things that he wrote and said. When he ran for president the 4th time, he had to run for president from a jail cell. How's that for freedom of speech and freedom of the press? Right? So once again, just as on our 14th Amendment timeline, we saw the Supreme Court not using the 14th Amendment to protect people, now we see the Supreme Court also not using the First Amendment to protect people. Unbelievable. So then we get to Abrams. And we can...
Wait, who is Freud?
highlight. All of these cases are people's names. They were all people who were thrown in jail. So Schenck, one thing that you can do the two that we're interested in most are Schenck and Abrams. Incitement is a kind of speech that what the government here is saying is that incitement is not protected by the First Amendment. What is incitement? What does it mean to incite someone?
To call them to action?
Yeah. But in particular, to incite lawless action, to incite violence and or the violent overthrow of government. And so what they're saying is these people, their words were so powerful that it would get you to overthrow the government. So, but anyway, so just make a note that this is a type of speech, because this will come up later. Incitement is a type of speech. Then we get to Abrams, and Abrams is the turning point moment. And remember, be clear with me here, the Supreme Court sided with the government in all 4 of these cases against the speaker. But Abrams is important because it gave us a glimmer, a glimpse of the future. So Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the decision that created the clear and present danger test. Then throughout the year, he saw the damage that that decision did, and he had a complete change of heart about it. So Abrams gives us Holmes's famous dissent in Abrams. Holmes's famous dissent in Abrams. And so this is the first significant breakthrough that we get in trying to give meaning to the First Amendment. and trying to hash out what does freedom of speech mean, what does freedom of the press mean. Holmes's famous dissent, Louis Brandeis, another great jurist, joined him in that. And he's especially disturbed. Remember when we did values of free expression, that handout that's on Blackboard, did we add dissent? Did we add an eighth? Let's add an eighth. Let's add 8. This is a particularly good time, I mean like right now in history, this is a really good time for us to add another value of free expression. And we're going to say one more value of free expression in terms of the First Amendment is protecting dissent. Protecting dissent. Dissent is a very particular type of speech. Dissent is not necessarily, by that we don't just mean you disagree. But the reason we need to protect, and this is one thing that Holmes is very concerned with here. I mean, these are people who are expressing political opinions, and it doesn't matter how unpopular their opinion is. It doesn't matter if 99.9% of the American public thinks that it is a moral and noble thing to do for the Obama administration to drop bombs on Syria. Even if 99% of the public feels that way and is just celebrating dropping bombs on Syria, it is extremely important in terms of the First Amendment to protect my right against mob rule. If I think, on the contrary, that dropping bombs on Syria is not only amoral, but it's illegal and it's unconstitutional, even if 99.9% of Americans agree with the opposing view, it is extremely important to protect my ability to dissent. Right? It's a very important kind of speech because we don't want mob rule. Right? So we'll say dissent, and if you want to, Steve Schifrin would be a good person. If you want to, he's written a lot about this. It's the idea of protecting the minority view from mob rule, if you want a parsimonious definition of it. That value is important because it's important that we protect the minority view from mob rule.
Majority rule.
Mm-hmm. We don't, but our system isn't really based on majority rule. A lot of people will argue that. Our system, as it has evolved, because of constitutional law, is about protecting minorities and minority viewpoints, and it's trying to keep us from being mob rule. And constitutional rules help promote that. So he's very concerned with that. And there's another on your values of free expression. That first one at the top, discovery of the truth. What's another special phrase you could use for that? Marketplace of ideas, which came from what? Areopagitica, written by Milton. Holmes borrows it. Holmes borrows that special phrase and uses it in his dissent. And this is the first time that that phrase is used in law, so it enters the legal canon. And why did judges even bother writing a dissent? It was a 7-2 decision. So he was in the extreme minority. Why would Holmes even bother to sit down and write? Why would he bother to write? Jabari, why would he bother to write a dissenting opinion? What does he hope will happen? What does he hope to accomplish by writing a dissenting opinion?
I mean, we hope that the court will rule in his favor, so maybe to appeal. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, the majority opinion sided with the government against the speaker, and he was writing a dissent, saying, I disagree. And here's why. And then he lays out all his reasons why he's going to dissent.
So,
Yes, then you do.
like, and I read first, and then kind of like the Declaration of Independence was a list of the claims. So it's similar to that.
Okay, so he's going to list all the reasons why he is discontented with the majority opinion. He's going to lay them out. Instead of just voting and his vote being counted as, I disagree with the majority, he's going to lay out all the specific reasons why. And why is he going to do that?
Because he flip-flopped and he switched his opinion around, so probably he's going to hope to make them do the same thing.
So he's hoping that maybe someone else will change their mind.
So you're providing like someone, like a citizen, the way to go about changing the law, like how they should go about attacking the Supreme Court.
He's outlining a litigation strategy for future cases. So he's saying, if you want to make this argument, here's how I would do it. Here are the things I would talk about. So that in future cases, somebody will make that litigation strategy. And yes, he's hoping someone else might change their mind. And yes, he's listing it systematically like the Declaration of Independence. Good. And that's exactly what happened. So the marketplace of idea phrase becomes a touchstone in First Amendment law. And in time, as we get further down the timeline, later people start using that argument and winning. And now today, a friend of mine did a study from 1919 to 1999. He looked at every First Amendment case in the federal system, so that's all the federal courts and the Supreme Court, that used the phrase marketplace of ideas. And 80% of the time, if any court ever started talking about marketplace of ideas, guess what they were about to do? What were they about to do?
Rule in favor of the person.
Yes, they were about to strike down a law as unconstitutional.
So it was like, he angered the other judge at the time, like his dissent,
No, it's a pretty genteel lot, right? And people dissent all the time. Also, he's a very elegant writer. It's really beautiful. You should read that dissent. You could probably just Google it, Holmes's Dissent in Abrams, because it's a very famous, well-studied piece of writing. It's really beautiful, well-crafted. Dissents that anger people are dissents like, for example, when Justice Scalia writes a real smart-ass dissent. He does that a lot.
That's his favorite.
Yeah, because his role on the court is as a grenade thrower. And there have been other justices in the past too. But anyway, so that dissent over time, the idea of it, marketplace of ideas, is the court starts talking about that whenever they're about to strike down the laws unconstitutional. The idea being we want a wide open, robust debate. We want a free marketplace of ideas. How am I doing on time? And when do we get out? Let's just blast on through. Maybe if we get through them, maybe we'll leave early. Like that. Instead of taking a break. So let me just move this real quick. Just so that I can make this part of the board. So then, okay, so the war finally ends. The country is sick of war. And the interwar years are a really special time. Yeah.
Did anyone ever act on like his utilization statutes? Are we making for that?
Yeah, you'll see it happen. You'll see it happen. And you'll see how this becomes the predominant, as I was just saying, this becomes then in later cases the predominant way we think about the First Amendment. The First Amendment before this, we don't even recognize, because as you can see here in the quartet of cases, the First Amendment ain't doing diddly. It's not how we think of the First Amendment. So then the war finally ends. People are sick of war. In times of war, we talk about there's a rally around the president effect, right? So people are more, we call this a repressive cycle. The government tends to try to squeeze our civil liberties during times of national crisis like that, and we tend to go along with it because it's a time of a national crisis. So there's a repressive cycle followed by a reactive cycle. That's when the crisis has passed. Then people push back against the government and say, no, enough. We're taking back our civil liberties. And that's what happened during the 20s. So the 20s is a very a great period in history, great in general. American history, very go-go time. You know, the sky's the limit. We're building skyscrapers. We're listening to jazz music, right? And think about technology. Think about we're communication majors, right? So think about how important 1919 the radio is experimental. Radio goes commercial in 1920. What's the first radio station in America? KTKA. 1920, also the very first news broadcast on radio. It was done out of the Detroit News in Detroit. And so we get that, the rise of a new technology. That's always exciting. Everyone was excited about radio, right? It was a new thing. And so everyone started switching from records to radio. Like I said, you know, we're building skyscrapers left and right. And it's just a very exciting time. Well, it was also a very creative time and a very important time for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And all of those things, remember we said that the Supreme Court likes to depict itself as being completely separate from society. That spirit of the age we start to see come into the law. And so we can, that partly is thanks to Taft, who becomes Chief Justice. Chief Justice. Who was Taft? In American history, who was Taft? He was a president.
William Howard Taft.
He was a president. And so he's out of office and he's looking for something to do. And they ask him to be Chief Justice and he says, why not? So Taft comes on the court. Someone in my students in class yesterday, the only thing that they could remember about Taft was when I asked that question, they said, he's the guy who was so fat he got stuck in the bathroom. I had never heard that. So anyway, so he comes on the court. He comes on the court, as we talked about with John Marshall in 1801, he comes on the court with a specific project in mind, and that project is increasing the power and prestige of the court. And so he sets about doing that. One way he does it is he starts talking about the need for a nicer building. And so he's the one who sets in motion the plan that created the Supreme Court building as we see it today. That building opened in 1935, but he's the one who laid the groundwork for that. The other thing he does is he goes to because remember, who controls the court system?
The legislative branch.
Congress. Article 1, Section 8 gives control over the court system and its makeup to Congress. So he works his friends in Congress. And remember, we said that 1789, we had the first Judiciary Act laying out the court system. The way the court system was laid out from then through the 19th century, we wouldn't recognize it. It doesn't look the same as today. And so very importantly, he gets his buddies to pass a new one, the Judiciary Act of 1925. And this is the first of 3 legal milestones of 1925. 3 legal milestones of 1925. Judiciary Act of 1925. It was also known, AKA, the Certiorari Act. The Certiorari Act. What is certiorari? Raw fish rolled with rice and bits of seaweed. What is certiorari?
A writ of certiorari is a call from a lower court, or pardon me, yeah, a call from a lower court to hear a case of the Supreme Court.
Is it from a lower court?
Or it's a call from the Supreme to get a lower court case.
close.
Or to hear a lower court case?
No, a writ,
Higher court can win.
what?
Oh, I was just saying higher court can win.
No. It isn't something that a court requests. Who requests a writ of cert? What does a writ of certiorari give someone? Here's the Supreme Court. Here's the appeals court. Here's the district court. All right, you go into district court and you are convicted of murder. And then you appeal your case to the appeals court. Your appeals court reviews what the district court did and says there's no problem. So you're still convicted of murder. And then what do you do?
Doesn't it like order the lower court to send it to the Supreme Court? To send the record of
It isn't. No, it is not. It isn't something that the lower court does. It's what you do.
Yeah.
So you were already convicted of murder, you appealed here, you lost here, you lost here. Then you ask the Supreme Court to review your case. So you petition the court for a writ of certiorari. And the Supreme Court can either grant certiorari or deny certiorari. If it grants certiorari, what does that mean?
That would be,
That it's going to hear your case. And if it denies certiorari, it's not going to hear your case.
Would that go to the appeals court?
You already lost. Watch me one more time, all right? You lost in district court, and so you appealed your case to the appeals court. You lost here again, and so you appeal it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, we'll hear your case. They'll grant certiorari. Or no, we won't hear your case. If they won't hear your case, you're through. You're in jail. It's the gas chamber. Yeah, it's over. It's over. That's the end of the line. So to grant, and we say CERT period, they can either grant cert or deny cert, right? And so this is the first time that this has been like this. Up until 1925, the Supreme Court had to accept your case, all cases. So if the Supreme Court got 1,000 requests in 1 year, guess what? They had to review all 1,000 cases. But now, the Supreme Court gets to pick and choose. Certiorari means the court gets to pick and choose which cases it wants to hear. Today, it only hears 80 to 90 cases per year. How does that fit into Taft's project of increasing the power and prestige of the court?
What makes the ones that actually go on mean that much more?
It makes those cases that they do accept much more significant and meaningful. Right? And it also means that they're only going to accept cases where they think there's some important dispute to settle.
You could also say like that, if there's less room for like overlapping, like if they give this in on one case and then there's another case that's similar, so like there's less confusion.
Maybe, and it also really cuts down on their workload. If they get a case and it's just like a case they just heard last year, they're just wasting their time doing another one that's just like that case. So they could be much more strategic. They can take a certain case because they want to change the law in a certain way. Right? So if we think of this as, it's really the birth of the modern Supreme Court. The Supreme Court before 1925 simply did not look and operate the way that we think of it.
I was going to ask a question, but I feel like it's a bigger question.
Well, ask if you want to.
I was going to say, do precedents ever change over time, or do they just stay the same?
No, they change over time. They change over time, and we'll see that as we lay some court cases out. In fact, we're going to see that with Schenck and incitement. So I promise you'll see that. So birth of the modern Supreme Court here. Also 1925, we have an important case, breakthrough case to log in on our 14th Amendment timeline. Pierce v. Society of Systems. Pierce is about what?
the Society of Sisters being a Catholic organization?
Yes,
Okay.
let me finish. Piersby Society of Sisters involves a Catholic organization, a school. These are nuns. And so, who was raised Catholic? All right, so I was too. You may or may not know, so Catholics were not always liked very much in America. And at this point, remember that 1919 is also a real sign of the times. 1919 is also the era of the second wave there are two great waves of immigration to the United States. The first one in the mid-19th century, and the second one in around this time, around 1917, 1819. My family came here from Italy, poor, in 1919. And there was a lot of backlash against immigrants, and there was big backlash against Catholics, right? Because you had already had the WASPy, white Protestants who were here from the time of the Mayflower. Then the second great wave in the 19th century, white people, mostly from places like Ireland, Norway, Poland. And so the second wave included a lot of dark-skinned people, like my olive-skinned Italian relatives. And they were actually called, my mother can tell you this, may shock you. Who's from New York? Long Island? Yeah. So this is Long Island in the 40s and 50s, and they all went to Catholic school, right? So the Italians and the Puerto Ricans were in one neighborhood, the Poles and the Irish were in another neighborhood, and the Germans in another neighborhood. And there were times when they would be walking to school, and the white boys, they were usually Irish, but the white boys from the white part of town would drive by and say the word nigger at them out of car with them, right? Racial politics were different then than they are now. So why were Catholics hated? Because they were immigrants, because they had this very foreign-seeming religion, and they were accused of being not loyal. They were called papists. You're a papist. Your loyalty is to the Pope in Italy, so you're not a loyal American. Right? So that's sort of how that happened. So, and part of why they were resented was because they had separate schools, Catholic schools. So Oregon passes a law saying that everybody has to go, you all have to send your children to public schools. And so the Catholics then have to figure out, how are we going to fight this under the law? Right? And when you think, all right, this has to do with religion, so why isn't it down on our First Amendment timeline? Why is it up there on the 14th Amendment timeline? Why can't you argue this case? Why can't you litigate this case as a First Amendment religion clause case? Yeah, but if it's a bunch of Catholics who feel like their rights have been violated, wouldn't it be tempting to litigate it as a religion case?
Well, I really saying they can't practice it, really, they shouldn't have to go to public school. I guess it's the same thing, they're just saying they have to go to school. They're saying outside of school they can practice what they want, they're not like saying what they...
Okay, that's what the government would say. The government would argue that, but they would say, you're abridging our freedom of religion. We want to all go to school together so that we can teach religion our way.
Isn't it they can still go to school? If they're also going to school together, they're just going to school, public school.
Still seems like their religious rights are being violated. I mean, because what if at the Catholic school they want to have a class where they teach religion their way, right? And if they had to send the kids to public school, they wouldn't get that religious instruction, right? Do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think the focus wasn't really that they were Catholic, but that they were trying to single them out because they were immigrants.
Maybe, but the net effect was that they singled them out because they were Catholic, because they had Catholic schools. All right, let me give you a hint. It's a state-level case. It's a dispute over a state law. Why can't you litigate it under the First Amendment?
Because the First Amendment's strictly federal, right?
Because the First Amendment operates only at the federal level. What are the two elements that must be present in order to have a First Amendment case?
A law.
A law that was passed by Congress. Do we have that here? No. So they had to be creative. So they said, well, let's do it under the 14th Amendment. Which clause of the 14th Amendment are you going to use to litigate this case? Are you going to use the Privileges or Immunities Clause?
No, because it got
No.
shut down.
Are you going to use the Equal Protection Clause?
No.
No, because that's an easy argument to shoot down. The government said you are getting equal protection. Everybody has to go to public school, equal. So that's not going to work. And so you're going to have to use the Due Process Clause. The Due Process Clause. So the due process protects your life, liberty, and property. Was the state of Oregon trying to interfere with those people's life? Like put them in jail or kill them? No. Was it trying to interfere with their property?
No.
No, their children are not property. And so the only word you can seize on is liberty. Liberty, it becomes the most important single word in the 14th Amendment, the most important word in the Due Process Clause. Because what is liberty? Can anyone precisely define what liberty is? Just like trying to define clear and present? No. And so it's a very elastic word. It can be stretched and stretched to mean all sorts of things. So the Supreme Court seizes on the word liberty and says, liberty also includes the freedom to educate your children how you will. So now they're turning, there are some earlier cases where they do this, but this, we're going to focus on this as the breakthrough. Using the word liberty like an empty vessel. And the Supreme Court can add meaning to the word liberty. Whenever the court wants to invent a new right or a new protection, it goes to the word liberty and adds some new meaning to it. And this is called SDP. Substantive due process. Substantive due process. Substantive due process is the process by which the Supreme Court adds new meaning to the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Substantive due process is the process by which the court adds new meaning to the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It is an extremely important concept.
And where does it add to the word?
The word liberty.
Liberty.
SDP is the process by which the court adds new meaning to the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It's how we get new rights. Roe v. Wade is not an abortion case. Roe v. Wade is a 14th Amendment substantive due process case. Because the court is adding privacy to liberty. Liberty becomes an empty vessel that the court can add all sorts of new meanings to. Substantive due process. And here, this is the reason this is a key turning point. Instead of using it to protect corporations and businesses, the Supreme Court starts using the 14th Amendment, finally, after all these years, to protect people, to protect individuals. And this is much closer to the way we think of the 14th Amendment today. So we can just think of this as birth of the modern 14th Amendment. Birth of the modern 14th Amendment. And finally, in 1925, I'll just put an arrow over here. We might as well just knock this out real quick. Gitlow v. New York, Gitlow. Gitlow v. New York. Notice it's a person who is suing the city of New York.
1925.
Okay. 3 legal milestones of 1925. All of these should line up on your, I just got a little bit off on your timeline. Goes to the court, says the court is the city's violating his First Amendment rights.
Is this under the First Amendment?
Yes, it's on the First Amendment timeline. Now, how can that be? Because we just said the reason that Pierce v. Society of Sisters wasn't a First Amendment case was because it was not at the federal level, it was a dispute at the state level. Here's a dispute at the state level too. Congress isn't involved, and a law passed by Congress isn't involved, and yet it's litigated as a First Amendment case, and it's because the court changed its mind. So here's an example of this is a straight up overturning an earlier decision. All of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, not just the First Amendment, all of the amendments up until this important moment only operate at the federal level. They're only about what the federal government can't do. The question went to the court, well, does the Bill of Rights apply to the states too? And the court emphatically said no. Barron v. Baltimore, 1833. So that question had been settled without doubt. Barron v. Baltimore, 1883.
Or 33.
1833. Google it and tell me if I'm right. Barron v. Baltimore, BVB, 1833. I was right. So the Supreme Court already had answered that question. So then this case was quite a shocking departure from that. In Gitlow v. New York, the court, it's funny when you're reading that decision because they don't even make a big deal of it, they don't explain it at all. They just toss off in one sentence, it has long been accepted that the First Amendment applies to the states. No footnote, no citation, no nothing, no mention of Barron v. Baltimore, they just said it. And it was really shocking to constitutional scholars at the time because they didn't even explain why they decided to change. And this starts a process called incorporation, and let me just at least get this definition in your notes. Keep it near substantive due process because what you'll notice is the definitions are similar, but they are distinctly and importantly different. Gitlow v. New York incorporated the speech clause. What do I mean by incorporated? It added the word speech to what other word? Liberty. So incorporation is the process by which the court adds or incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. Because remember, the words of the 14th Amendment, it says, no state shall. And so if you add freedom of speech into the word liberty, it means no state shall abridge your freedom of speech. And that's what they did. They added, I'm going to say it again, they added the idea of freedom of speech to liberty. So they said, liberty also includes freedom of speech. And no state shall abridge your freedom of speech. It's how they reach down to the state and local level. And they didn't do all of the Bill of Rights at once. They do it clause by clause by clause. It took 6 different cases to incorporate the whole First Amendment. Incorporation is the process by which the court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level, and it's that last part that's the crucial thing that's important. If you don't have that last part, then you're just talking about SDP, right? Because SDP is just adding new meaning to the word liberty. But this is adding new meaning to the word liberty in order to reach down to the state and local level. And so now, starting with Gitlow,
Can you just say the last part?
Incorporation is the process by which the court adds parts of the Bill of Rights to the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. And whenever you're studying, you have to do that hand movement down to the state and local level. It'll help you remember. So that is a very important process. You know, it took all the way through 1969 for them to incorporate most of the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment was never incorporated. The Second Amendment was never incorporated. That means that the Second Amendment doesn't apply at the state and local level. Okay? So now, from henceforth, the First Amendment is going to apply at the state and local level, not just federal. And so we can say the birth of what? The birth of what? The modern First Amendment. Three legal milestones of 1925. Okay? Good. We'll pick it up on Monday. Have a good weekend.